Hey, folks, welcome back to the show. We have a great episode for you today. We have a repeat guest, Kiran Krishnan, who is a true expert when it comes to the human microbiome and how we can work on making it healthier. We talk about a lot of different things, including a particular type of probiotics that you may or may not have heard of that turns out to be probably the most efficacious when it comes to shifting our microbiome into a better direction. But before we do that, of course, want to thank you for being here. I'd love to encourage you to visit natnidham.com. That's where you'll learn about the BSP community, which is my private membership community, and also where you can sign up for my newsletter, which is a weekly newsletter. We probably send out maybe 2 or 3 newsletters a week, always packed full of good ideas and information. All right, let's talk about our episode. Hey there. Welcome back. Your mood, energy, immune system, and even brain function are about to get an upgrade. We're diving into a topic that's probably affecting you more than you realize, your gut health. And with that one really easy way to improve many aspects of your health, probiotics. Now, we all know that there are so many probiotics out there, but why is that? Are any of them actually worth taking? Now, my guest, Kiran Krishnan, is the probiotic expert, and he's about to answer both of these questions for you and so much more. He knows just about everything there is to know about how probiotics interact with our own communities of microbes, having spent his entire adult life in labs and developing scientific research on the gut microbiome. Finally, he also sheds light on spore-biotics specifically, what they are, and why they may not only be safer, but more efficacious than regular probiotics. Now, for listeners of this podcast, you get access to a special offer. You can get 20% off a 90-day supply of spore-biotics or Just Calm, their psychobiotic, at justthrivehealth.com/nat20, and make sure to use code NAT20. And then if you want to follow Kiran Krishnan and learn more about him, you can follow him on Instagram at Kiran Krishnan. And of course, Just Thrive Health on Instagram as well. And now let's jump into the episode.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider.
Welcome back to the show, Kiran Krishnan. It is a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah, and it's been a while. I think it's been about a year, right?
About a year, yeah. I think we connected at some show in the fall last year, and we're like, we got to get back together on the podcast. So yeah, it's been about a year, and it's crazy how fast a year flies by. Right?
It's ridiculous. Like it just whips. But anyway, we're here to talk about probiotics, and you are the man to talk about probiotics with. So, but before we really get specific, let's kind of lay down the groundwork for people all around kind of gut health. I mean, everybody keeps talking about how everybody's gut health is crap. And it's because of this, that, and the other thing. And maybe let's kind of lay the terrain down for people about what's happening to the human microbiome kind of thing. And how do you know if your gut health is wacky? And then we're just going to go from there, because I know we've got about 20 different places we could go from there.
We could, yeah, because it really affects everything, right? So at the end of the day, we have a digestive system which has these very specialized organs, starting with the mouth, then the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, the liver is part of that digestive tract as well. But all of those organs require a certain microbial population to function properly. And that's the part that's often missed or there's misnomers around it, right? So the stomach wouldn't function like the stomach should if there was a significant amount of dysbiosis in the stomach. If you had overgrowth of Helicobacter pylori or lots of gram-negative bacteria, the stomach wouldn't function the way stomachs are supposed to. Small bowel, same thing, right? So that's something that most people can identify with, because when the microbe population changes in the small bowel, it changes how the small bowel functions in the case of SIBO, for example, or IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease. Those are all examples of the organ system not functioning the way it's intended to because of a shift in the ecosystem that governs that organ.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the really important part that people have to really grasp onto is that, yes, you have an intestine. It's a very complicated organ system. It's biological elegance. It's beautiful, right? How it's built. However, its functionality is dependent on the right microbial population. And if the microbes are off, the system doesn't function the way it should, starting with your mouth, your stomach, your large, small intestine, the liver, everything, right? So this is why the microbiome and the ecosystem in your body is so important for gut health to be optimal and for gut health to even function.
Yeah.
This is also the reason why so many people are suffering so significantly from dysfunctional guts and dysfunctional gut as a result of dysfunctional gut microbiomes, because we are doing so many things on a daily basis that decimates our gut microbiome, right? And if we're decimating our gut microbiome, we're decimating the function of our digestive tract. And when we decimate the function of the digestive tract, all other systems in the body start to fall apart.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the connection that people really need to keep in mind.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned all these different body parts, because people think of very often people will think of the gut microbiome as what's happening in their lower intestine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what gets missed a lot is that you have a microbiome you have a specific microbiome in the inside of your nose. You have another one in your ears, the surface of your skin, which we've talked about. I think the last episode we did was about the skin.
Yeah.
Inside the mouth, like every single surface and inside and outside of the body really relies on this microbial cohort, if you will, to function properly. And I definitely want to get into what is it that's happening right now that's really it's throwing everything off kilter. And at the same time, you've got like this plethora of gut testing kits out there, and everybody says everybody else's is no good. And you know what I mean? Everybody. And the truth of the matter is that there's no real holy grail to the microbiome. We don't have, it's not like it's not like all the guys with the testing kits have this perfect gut microbiome poster on their wall that everybody should be shooting for. And maybe we want to talk about that a little bit, because, I think people need to understand that they can have a very good microbiome, even if it's different from somebody else's. And how is that even possible?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's really important to understand that. And this is where a lot of the testing kits kind of fall apart, right? Because we don't have a picture of an ideal microbiome. You and I could each have perfectly healthy and functional microbiomes, but we could have as little as 20-30% similarity at the species level of organisms that we have within our microbiome, right? So how does that make sense? Well, because our microbiomes can be so diverse, you could have upwards of 1,000 different species in your microbiome. And what's interesting about it is that there's a lot of functional redundancy within your microbiome, right? I might have a different group of organisms that make, for example, short chain fatty acids for me than you have for you. We both might make adequate amounts of short chain fatty acids, but you might have 6 different players that do that than I do, right? So just looking at both our microbiomes, it becomes hard to discern who has the healthier, better microbiome if we're just looking at what organisms are there in terms of what species and so on. What we really need to understand is what functions are preserved in an individual's microbiome, right? Do you have adequate number of microbes that produce short chain fatty acids relative to the rest of the microbiome? Do I have adequate number of microbes, even though they're different microbes? Are they there, and are they present at high enough levels relative to the rest of the microbiome? Which means that we're both producing adequate amounts of short chain fatty acids, so we're both okay in that regard. Right?
So then would it almost be better to be looking at the output instead of the species? I mean, I'm sure that you can I know we can have an overgrowth of certain species that are going to dominate and push down the beneficial species. So there is some value in looking at who the players are, what the players are in there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it seems to me that what you're really looking for is what's the output of this community to give us, to really give us insight
Yeah. Now you can gauge the output of the community by sequencing, by the types of microbes that are there and the capabilities that they have, right?
Okay.
So, but that look is really important. Looking at it from a functional perspective, right? So
Hmm.
not just a list of microbes on your microbiome, that's meaningless, right? It's the question is, you know, what percentage of your microbes are saccharolytic microbes versus proteolytic microbes? So that means that you may do better with plant-based material, lots of fiber. Your saccharolytic microbes are going to convert that to all kinds of wonderful things. And you may not do as well with protein, because your proteolytic microbes are dysfunctional and they may
Hmm.
produce too many negative byproducts as a result of protein degradation. You might have things like sulfate reducing microbes, right? So you might have too big of a group of sulfate reducing microbes, which means that all of these really healthy sulfate rich foods that we know of, so things like meats and eggs and leeks and,
Broccoli.
cauliflower and
Yeah.
mushrooms and broccoli and all that, those are all wonderful foods. But for an individual with a really high number of sulfate reducing microbes, they'll convert too much of that food into hydrogen sulfide, which can be very inflammatory for the bowel, right? So
Yeah.
understanding that functionality becomes really important.
Okay. So now I have a follow-up question to that. So let's say you have an overabundance of one over the other, or
Hmm.
any number of these. Where do we draw the line in accommodation versus of evolution? So
Hmm.
basically, if I have that preponderance of bugs that do really well with plants, but I don't have enough of the ones that would break down my protein, do I just kind of say, oh, well, I guess I need to be a vegetarian? Or is there a world where I sit there and say, well, actually, can I change the population? Can I cultivate more of these proteolytic bacteria
Hmm.
so that my body can process protein properly? Like,
Yes.
where do
So
you draw that line, right?
yeah, I think the goal always needs to be around diversity.
Okay.
So I would say that you'd always want a balance of microbes.
Hmm.
Now there are going to be some regional changes that are probably not relevant to us in North America. So when I say regional changes, I mean, like, if you look at the Inuit Indians, right, who happened over generations to basically consume a lot of seal blubber and a few berries and things like that, their microbiomes are going to be heavily modulated and adapted for that very
Yeah.
unique diet, right?
Yeah.
Same thing if you look at like the Papua New Guinea tribes, they eat so much resistant starch as part of their diet that their microbiomes are modulated a lot more towards resistant starches. So
Hmm.
barring those kind of geographic
Like
absurdities or
extremes.
uniqueness, yeah,
Yeah.
extremes, most people in the Western world have the opportunity to eat a pretty diverse diet. And ultimately, that drives a higher amount of diversity within your microbiome, which most studies have shown that diversity is the ultimate marking of a healthy microbiome and a healthy outcome. In fact, you can use diversity in the microbiome as a very accurate predictor for longevity, disease risk, mortality, and so on. So if I looked at my microbiome testing and I said, oh my God, I have 80% saccharolytic bacteria, very small amount of proteolytic bacteria, I would want to shift that back to closer to a 60-40, 50-50-ish balance.
Hmm.
Because I want that resilience. I want
Yeah.
that diversity, right? I want to be able to eat a large variety of things and not be affected by it negatively.
Yeah.
So I'm always pushing towards that diversity, and we need to make those adjustments. But you can only know those things if your microbiome test is geared towards functionality rather
Hmm.
than geared towards just a listing of species,
Right.
right? And
Right.
too many microbiome tests I see just have this random listing of species with a very heavy focus on pathogens.
Hmm.
Right. That's another area where I think microbiome tests have gone awry. Is there's an absurd obsession with pathogens and what the level of pathogens are in the system without providing context to the rest of the microbiome. Right. So
Hmm.
we know naturally we all have pathogens within our microbiome. That's a normal part of our commensals. In fact, many pathogens can have beneficial effect as
Yeah.
long as they haven't reached a certain threshold amount. Right. So if I'm looking at pathogens in my gut, I would want to know what the relative abundance of those pathogens are to the rest of the microbiome, because that is really what matters, right? Just the fact that they're there is immaterial, doesn't really matter. What we really want to know is what is their relative abundance to the rest of the commensals. If their relative abundance is high to the rest of the commensals, that's when they could be causing a problem.
Yeah.
When their relative abundance is not high next to the commensals, and what kind of commensals there are, they're probably not causing a problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No.
that misdirects people too much, because it just causes people to focus so much on killing things and like, oh my God, I've got a pathogen here. That's probably the cause of most of my problems. And I'm just going to bombard the area with antibiotics, antimicrobials, whatever it may be, to try to kill things. But that rarely solves the problem, right?
Well, and it's rarely specific enough, right? Once you go on a killing spree, you're just going to kill stuff, and
you're killing everything. Yeah, there's really nothing that specifically kills bad bacteria and preserves good bacteria. Now, here's the other thing. When I was at Microbiome Labs, we had a whole genome sequencing test called BiomeFX that really focuses on functionality. So we'd run, by the time I left, we'd run probably 20,000 tests. And so I got to see a lot of microbiome data. And when you take a look at real data in the microbiome, the kind of data that can be published in peer-reviewed journals, what you tend to find is that most people's gut-related problems aren't usually due to the presence of a pathogen. It's usually due to the absence of a good bacteria or a number of good bacteria, right?
Yeah,
it's
an
not
imbalance.
The presence.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's not the presence of a function. It's the lack of certain functions. The inability to produce short chain fatty acids, the inability to make lactic acid, the inability to create urolithins, the inability to modulate the immune system, right? All of those things, those are the missing links behind why the gut is dysfunctional. It's rarely the presence of a pathogen that's just going crazy and producing toxins and harming you, right? And so we need that paradigm shift where we have to rethink this idea of terraforming the environment, and not look at bombarding, killing. We should be looking at how do we bring back some of the low prevalence beneficial microbes.
Yeah. Well, it's so, the analogy of a garden is so apt, right? Because very often you're planting, every once in a while you do have to kill something off or you have to rip it out. But for the most part, you're encouraging, you're feeding, you're nurturing, you're promoting, and you're crowding out. It's this whole nature hates a vacuum thing. Like you're crowding out what you don't want, and you're really nurturing the things that you do want. And it also reminds me a bit about this dialogue between omega-6 and omega-3. Like people are running around screaming about omega-6 is the enemy, and we have to kill omega-6 and get rid of it in the diet and get rid of all the seed oils and the whole 9 yards. Yes, there's an overpreponderance of omega-6 if you're eating a lot of packaged foods.
Yeah.
But really the answer is, can you increase your intake and presence of omega-3? It's about that delta, I think, which is again what you're talking about.
Yeah, and in fact, when you look at the omega-6, omega-3 debate, if you have a healthy, diverse microbiome, there are components of your microbiome that convert 6 to 3. And there's a benefit there in doing that conversion. And coming back to the analogy of a garden, if you think about, so you think about conventional farming now, right? So the worst of the worst kind of farming, right? We're using GMO crops, we're using all kinds of chemicals and all that. What we've essentially done is we've stripped the land, the soil itself, of biodiversity. Yeah. Right. We're growing things in a lack of biodiversity. So we're growing monocrops, right? Just monocrops. And then we also, because we use so many chemicals, we've killed off most of the normal flora, fauna that would be in a biodiverse environment that would control pests, that would control infections, that would control other things in these crops. And as a result of that, we just have to keep using more and more chemicals to prevent things from going awry. Whereas when you look at, a biodiverse garden or farm, I was just in Croatia this past summer, and we went out and we were able to see a lot of like small little biodiverse farms where they were growing some of the most amazing things. And all of those farms have, underlying crops at the bottom that
Yeah.
help control
Yeah.
what happens with the pests, right? They've got, other insects and birds and all that control some of the pests. They've got a large amount of biodiversity around the crops that provides a stability and a degree of competition in that environment to allow numerous things to thrive. So
Yeah.
our guts, the way we think about our guts, that we can look at that analogous to a corporate farm that is now, inundated with overgrowth of bad nuisance because we don't have the biodiversity. So we keep putting chemicals in there to try to go after the nuisance, where we should be a much more biodiverse organic farm,
Yeah.
right? And that's the difference, right? Between like, let's let nature and diversity within nature control the problematic organisms, rather than us going there with chemistry and chemicals and trying to kill them ourselves, when we're probably doing more harm than good.
100%. And it's that whole monoculture thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's how we got ourselves into trouble in agriculture. I think that probably when farming started, there was a certain degree of biodiversity, and it's,
Mhm.
in an effort to say, well, I just want more squash.
Yeah.
So I'm only going to plant squash, and I don't want
Mhm.
any of this other stuff in here because it's going to reduce the number of squash plants I can have. And it's turned around and completely bitten us
Yeah.
in the end, right? And you end up with farmers who have fallow soil that just won't grow anything anymore, and it becomes a real problem. So, but anyway, let's back off the gardens and farms, because everybody's sitting there going, okay, well, whatever, what does this mean to me? So let's talk a little bit about how all this lack of this, maybe how can this lack of diversity or imbalance, so we can call it one or the other, and it's probably a combination of the two. How's this going to show up? And I think, we can start by things on the way out, but then I think that this discussion around how the microbiome and how gut health is really affecting people's mental health and their cognitive health and function is a big discussion that I've heard you speak to it a number of times, and it is fascinating, the research that's coming out in that area. So you can decide which way to go first.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about, some of the things that are hurting our biodiversity on a regular basis. And then, what does that lead to, right? In terms of dysfunction, not only in the gut, but then how does that translate to the rest of the body? So, the 30,000 foot view is this. We are a microbial entity, meaning that we have more microbes than human cells in our system. We've got way more microbial DNA and genetics in our system than human DNA. We have about 150 times more microbial genetics, around roughly 2.5, 3 million genes versus 21,000 human genes, right? So, the microbes and microbial population dictate so much of our function. So, and we are a walking, talking rainforest. We're made up of all of these different ecosystems within one entity. And all of these different ecosystems have to communicate with each other, work with each other, support each other in order to function as a whole. So we're this beautiful, elegant microbial entity, and we've put this microbial entity in a very antimicrobial world. Right. So the world we've built around us is very antimicrobial. So you could say that in another way. You could say that we live in an anti-human world. Almost everything we have around us, all the things we've invented and discovered and put together, the large percentage of them have some negative impact on our microbial ecosystem, starting with the foods we mostly eat, right? So we talked about packaged foods and highly processed foods. Of course, they've got pesticides and herbicides in them. They've got preservatives. They've got antimicrobials. They've got preventative agents that prevent growth. And then they've got food colorings and dyes and flavorings and all of these things that aren't beneficial for the microbiome. And not only are they not beneficial, they in fact kill and reduce the diversity of the microbiome. On top of that, they're packaged in plastics and all of these, corrosive and toxigenic materials that leach into that food. So you're getting bisphosphenol and BPAs and all these things into your food that you're now consuming, right? So the majority of Americans and people in the Western world are consuming a large portion of their diet from non-nutritive, highly calorically dense, laced food that is full of toxins and herbicides and pesticides that kill off your microbiome. Right. So starting with food alone, we're really devastating our system. Now, on top of that, you just think about most of the things around us, the paints and the dyes and the glues and, the personal care products with the parabens and phthalates and synthetic fragrances and all of those
We're
things.
going to have a solution to this, right?
We are, yes.
Okay, good.
I promise.
Hang in, people. You do not need to commit Harry Carey just yet. Keep going. Sorry.
Yep. And the VOCs in the air, right? All the things we breathe. I mean, we literally live in one of the most toxigenic environments we can think of. But we have this false notion that everything is clean and pure, right? We're not a third world country. We're not living in the slums, right? And so because there is an open sewage and defecation everywhere and all that, we think we are clean. And we've also been programmed to think this like synthetic lemon smell everywhere, that sterile look is clean.
Yeah.
Right. And all of those are the opposite of the kind of clean that our system needs, which is our system needs more biodiversity. Right. So we've got toxins everywhere that are killing our microbiome. We're not exposed to microbes the way we're supposed to be exposed to. You pair all that together, you add in stress, anxiety, lack of sleep, lack of exercise, immobility, all of those things. And all of those things together have a huge negative impact on our overall ecosystem. I'm actually shocked that we are not even sicker than we are already, right? It's shocking to me that we can still live into our 80s. Of course, most people not very functionally, right?
That's the thing, right? It's
the quality of life.
We're good at keeping people alive.
Yeah.
It's the vitality piece that's kind of getting lost.
Is. And the quality of life, right? I mean, like people are just immobile and not functional for the last third of their life in many cases. And then you look at the epidemics that we have, the epidemic of asthma, allergies among kids, food intolerances. We've got, a spectrum disorders, anxiety, depression, all of those, right?
Even fat, I mean, even over obesity, right, is an epidemic, and metabolic imbalances is epidemic. And I think all of them draw lines back to this issue.
They do. And so when you look at all the things that are continuing to increase in prevalence, so when you look at childhood obesity, adult obesity, spectrum disorders, cognitive dysfunction, so ADD, ADHD, anxiety, depression, all of those continue to increase despite billions of dollars in research and pharmaceuticals and all that. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dementia, Alzheimer's, right? Alzheimer's, which is considered type 3 diabetes now in many cases. Parkinson's, ALS, all of those things are increasing. Obesity, like you mentioned, metabolic syndrome, and everything under that umbrella continues to increase. All of those disease conditions are continuing to increase. 40 years ago, we had something like 38 autoimmune diseases. Now we have over 110. So we've created, 3 times as many autoimmune diseases that we have to deal with now. All of those things keep increasing. And the crazy thing about this, without being hyperbolic about it, is virtually all of those things I mentioned can be traced back to some dysfunction in the gut microbiome being at least a driver, if not the root cause of the disease, at least a driver of the pathology, and or a reason why you cannot make significant improvement in the condition, right? Obesity is a great example of that. Type 2 diabetes is a great example of that, right? Those are conditions that you cannot improve on unless you make a significant improvement in your gut microbiome and all of the lifestyle things that we know to be good for those conditions, right? The exercise, the improvement in diets, the going to cleaner foods, increasing fiber, caloric restriction, all of those things all help the individual in numerous ways, including in large part by improving the gut microbiome. Yeah. Right. So dismantling the gut microbiome in one way or the other through all the things we talked about is, to me, one of the most profound things that's happening that's driving chronic disease prevalence in the Western world. And the clinical manifestation of dysbiosis is leaky gut. Right. Leaky gut becomes how a dysbiotic gut can create clinical pathology. Right. And we could take any of those conditions that I talked about. We could start with anxiety and depression because it's so prevalent. and talk about how a dysfunctional gut microbiome can create those conditions in
Yeah.
people, right?
Let's do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's jump into that. So if you think about something called the gut-brain axis, there's a deep connection between the gut and the brain because the gut and the brain are connected through numerous systems. Number one, there's a neurological connection. So the gut is surrounded by this very dense neurological system called the enteric nervous system. Second highest density in nerve endings, even more so than your spinal cord, next to the brain, right? So it's almost like the second or the other brain.
Yep.
That enteric nervous system is fully accessible to the microbes, the trillions of microbes that live in the digestive tract. And that enteric nervous system is connected to the central nervous system, which is your brain stem and your brain and all that, through the vagus nerve, right? So you've got this neurological connection. What's interesting about the vagus nerve is that it's a bidirectional highway, meaning messages go both ways. However, what seems to be clear is that 80% of the messages on that highway are going from the gut to the brain, and only about 20% go from the brain to the gut, right?
Yeah.
So then that gives you a clue as to like where a lot of the information is coming from as to what is going on, what's happening metabolically, immunologically, in the environment and all that. A lot of it's coming from the gut, going to the brain and telling the brain what to do. So we have the gut-brain axis through the neurological connection. Then we have the immunological connection, right? So we've got our circulation, our lymphatic system, 75+% of the immune tissue in your body is in your gut. It's kind of the central command center for your gut, for your immune system. And the immune system has a profound effect on your blood-brain barrier and your brain itself and your central nervous system, right? And I'll come back to how that's affected. And then the third part is also through circulation, where there are byproducts and production products being made in your gut that then have a huge impact on your brain, right? Like neurotransmitters, for example, or hormones or hormone precursors, or nutrients, of course. And then there is energy balance. And we'll talk about the role between the gut and the liver and what the brain needs in order to function, right? So that establishes how they're connected. So let's talk for a moment about how then when you disrupt the gut, does the brain start to suffer as a result of that? And it's a multi-pronged attack on the brain.
Yeah.
So the first part is when you become dysbiotic in your gut, so your imbalance of microbes, you end up with leaky gut. And the reason why you end up with leaky gut is all of the systems in the lining of the gut that control what comes through and what shouldn't come through are governed by the presence of microbes, right? This goes back to my earlier statement about you have an organ system, but how the organ system functions is based on what the microbial population looks like. So your intestine is supposed to be selectively permeable. You're supposed to allow nutrients in and food components and all that, but it's supposed to close the gates when it's time for toxins to come in or microbial byproducts and so on, right? So that dynamic control of permeability is governed by a microbial ecosystem. So when the microbial ecosystem is diminished through all the things we talked about earlier that diminish the microbiome, you start to get a leaky gut. And a leaky gut simply means that things that shouldn't be going through, like toxins, endotoxins, exotoxins, and all that, are now constantly leaking through the lining of the gut, which means they end up through the liver and into circulation, right?
Yep.
Now, the most profound component of leaky gut is the leaking in of an endotoxin called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. LPS is made in large amounts in the lining of the gut because about 50% or so of the microbes in your gut microbiome, good, normal, commensal microbes, and then some pathogens, make this LPS. Now, in a healthy gut microbiome, LPS, when it's released by these bacteria in the lining, often get neutralized either by your IgA, which is your secretory immunoglobulin, or other microbes break it up and neutralize it, or it just moves out through defecation, right? It's not supposed to leak through. In a leaky gut, what happens is it constantly leaks through and ends up in circulation. it does then a couple of different things. Number one, it's very pervasive. It can make its way all throughout the body, up the
Yeah.
vagus nerve, into the brain, cross the blood-brain barrier, enter into the brain. Once it enters into the brain, it elicits an immunological response because your microbes, your immune system in the central nervous system in the brain thinks that you're getting invaded by microbes in the brain because it
Yeah.
registers this as a microbial part, right? And so as a result, it upregulates inflammation. So the presence of this endotoxin in your central nervous system upregulates inflammation by activating microglial cells and cytokines that elicit an inflammatory response. Now, when you do that, a couple of things happen. Number one, you activate the HPA axis. The presence of inflammation causes the HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, to release cortisol. And cortisol puts you into a fight or flight, right?
Yep.
So now you're in this panic kind of fight or flight state. If you have this inflammation happening constantly throughout the day, you're constantly being put back into the fight or flight response. That's why people have this kind of basal level of anxiety throughout the day, right? Because they're constantly in this sympathetic fight or flight response. On top of that, the increase in inflammation in the brain also increases the production of reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species. These things create a significant amount of oxidative damage to the neurons. So now you start to get neurodegeneration as well, right? On the myelin sheets, the insulation around the neurons themselves, and the proteins that the brain requires in order to function. The proteins like, tau proteins or alpha-synuclein, or one that's very well known in the case of dementia and Alzheimer's is amyloid beta proteins, right? So these proteins, what are very important for functionality. They bridge the space between synapses. They allow for, creating more neurons. They allow for the insulation around the neurons and all that. But what happens in the face of inflammation and in the face of reactive oxygen species is that these proteins become misfolded. And the misfolded proteins end up becoming plaques. And the plaques stop neurological communication and increase inflammation even more, right? They elicit more of an immune response. So now you've got more plaques eliciting more immune response, and that increased immune response creates more misfolded protein, which then creates more inflammation, more stress, anxiety, and so on. So it's a self-perpetuating problem, right?
Yeah.
All of that from the gut being leaky in itself. Now, other things that are happening when the gut is leaky. So beyond the whole inflammatory thing I talked about, LPS itself has a way of interfering with dopamine and serotonin binding in their receptors in the brain. So even if you're making enough serotonin or dopamine, that serotonin might make its way to the brain, or the dopamine make its way to the brain, and it can't bind its receptor because LPS, that endotoxin, is sitting there, right? So it's interfering with your ability to utilize your happy hormone, your reward centers, your prefrontal cortex, your executive center of the brain, and so on. So that is a double whammy. You've got the leaky gut creating inflammation that takes you down this process of HPA activation, fight or flight response, misfolding of proteins, developing these plaques in the brain, and so on. And then on top of that, these endotoxins also interfere with serotonin and dopamine binding. But it doesn't stop there, unfortunately.
Oh my God.
Right? It gets worse, right?
It gets worse. It's going to get better though, guys. Hang in. Hang in there. There's a solution, I promise.
There's always a solution, which is great about this, right? Now, on top of that, the other thing that happens is most of your serotonin and a good amount of your dopamine is actually produced in your gut. And there are cells called enterochromaffin cells in the lining of your gut that are the cells that produce your serotonin and dopamine, right? And you need those cells to produce serotonin and dopamine, and you have microbes that stimulate those cells to produce serotonin and dopamine. If your gut is dysbiotic, leaky, dysfunctional, you're also not stimulating the production of serotonin and dopamine appropriately, right? So then you're not even making enough, and whatever you make can't function properly because it can't bind because the LPS is sitting in the receptor site. On top of that, Then the precursors for serotonin and dopamine, things like tyrosine and tryptophan are really important amino acids. Those are also synthesized by the gut and by the liver. And anytime your gut is leaky, your liver is undergoing a significant amount of dysfunction, right? Because your liver is taking 80% of the toxins that are leaking through from your gut and trying to deal with it. And so liver function starts getting compromised. The liver is no longer making the precursors that your body needs to create serotonin and dopamine. So that's another area where those neurotransmitters get dampened. And the final thing, right, is that the brain gut liver axis is a very important axis for the brain to manage its energy needs and its energy resources, right? So, the brain's primary fuel 99% of the time is glucose, right?
Yep.
The brain needs sugar. Now, in rare, very stressed states, the brain may be able to use a small amount of ketone bodies that can be made by the liver, but there's a misconception around ketone bodies. So when you go into fasted state, which can be beneficial, and people say, oh, I want to go into ketosis because it's good for me. Ketosis doesn't mean that the ketone bodies that are being produced are feeding your brain. In fact, the reason the ketone bodies are made is to feed other systems in the body so that the brain can exclusively have most of the glucose, right?
Really?
Yeah.
But in type 3 diabetes, that Alzheimer's thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't the brain become insulin resistant? And so then the glucose can't get into the cell? Do ketones not come to the rescue there? Or is there a different mechanism?
They don't. So that's one of the problems with it, right? Because when you go down that process, the brain can no longer get the energy it needs to regenerate neurons and synapses and pull out memories and things like that. This is why you start losing cognition, right? Because ketone bodies cannot come to the rescue of the brain. The brain, even if you're in ketosis, primarily wants to use sugar. The main point of ketosis is to feed other systems so they don't demand sugar from the brain.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. That's a different spin than I've ever heard. That's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And so
you heard it here.
And so, let's think about it. We can create the analogy in a very simple way, right? So it's said that you've got about half a teaspoon of sugar in your blood at all times. Right. And that's like the balance that your body's trying to maintain. Now, if you go above half a teaspoon, too far above, you're going to a diabetic state, right? And that's a problem.
Yeah.
Hyperglycemia and all kinds of issues that come along with that. But if you go below that too far, you could die because your brain no longer has its fuel. So how is that state balanced so delicately, right? That is balanced by your brain reading the energy needs of the body and then communicating down to the gut and the liver to produce glycogen or glucose, convert glycogen to glucose or produce more glucose from fat and other things so that it can feed the brain. So this connection between the gut-brain axis becomes really, really important. And if that gets corrupted as a result of leaky gut, and inflammation that damages the communication in the vagus nerve or hurts the liver or any of the combination of those, you also end up with an energy balance issue for the brain, right? So not only is your brain inflamed, right? Because of the leaky gut and the directing of inflammation towards the brain, you're in the fight or flight response most of the time. The dopamine and serotonin receptors are corrupted by the presence of LPS. You're not even making enough dopamine and serotonin because your gut is dysbiotic. And then you don't make enough of the precursors because your gut and liver are dysfunctional. And then on top of that, the liver is having a hard time keeping an energy balance correct because the gut, liver, brain axis is corrupted. So you're often in this fatigue, brain fog, cognitive decline, memory issues, and all that. Your liver is likely not making enough acetylcholine either, which is really important for focus and function and all that. Likely maybe why we have this massive ADD problem in society among kids and adults, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the final whammy of it all, right, is that our brain is designed to be fixed every night when we go to bed, right? So it's understood by the body that your brain is going to go through some degree of inflammatory or other damage throughout the day because the brain is doing a lot of things and it's taking on a lot of energy, metabolism, and so on. So it's going to go through some damage. But when you go to sleep at night, your healthy gut produces something called BDNF. brain-derived neurotropic factor, right? That neurotropic factor goes up and repairs all the damage that occurred throughout the day, and in fact can increase synaptogenesis and neuroplasticity and reapply insulation around the myelin sheets and things like that. So it's basically repairing all the things that went awry. And that is also not happening now because of a dysfunctional gut, right? So when you think about how impactful a dysfunctional gut can be on the brain and the central nervous system, the list is just mind-boggling.
It's catastrophic.
Right?
Yeah.
It is catastrophic, right? And this is why, dementia, anxiety, depression, Parkinson's, ALS, MS, all of those things are increasing in prevalence, year after year after year. And one of the things I have often said when I'm lecturing on the gut-brain axis is that what we experience today as anxiety or depression or some sort of mood disorder, or even brain fatigue or cognitive decline or memory issues or brain fog, right? What we experience that is our early stages of dementia and Alzheimer's, right?
Wow.
And why would I say that? Well, because the pathology that creates
different.
anxiety and depression and all that is exactly the same pathology that creates dementia, right?
Yeah.
The difference between the two is that when you get to a point where the damage to the brain is irrecoverable and you haven't been able to repair your brain faster than it's being damaged, you start to get the onset of things like dementia and Alzheimer's and all that, right?
Yeah.
But the pathology is the same. It's still driven by inflammation and all the things we just talked about. So there's a profound need to really pay attention not only to the gut microbiome, leaky gut, diversity, all of that, but then also this gut-brain axis and gut-brain-liver axis too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're not going to get into all the other things, because I think we need to get into some solutions, because at this point, if anybody's listening and doesn't think we need a solution here, we need a solution. And it's not as simple. And I keep saying this to people. It's not as simple as throwing a peptide at it. Right. We have, there's this BPC 157 peptide that can be really good. There's lorazepatide, which is really good at sealing tight junctions, and KPV, which helps with inflammation. But fundamentally, if we haven't addressed what's driving the issue in the first place, you're still kind of trying to bail out a leaky boat. And if you're lucky, you can kind of keep up for a while, but eventually you get overwhelmed. So let's talk a little bit about the solutions. And I know that, I think we can all kind of gather that whatever you can do to minimize and reduce the number of toxins that you're exposing your body to is going to be beneficial. So try to eat organic food, try to get your hands in the dirt. You said this very briefly earlier, but exposure to the right microbes and germs is actually what informs our immune system. It does help our microbiome. This is why they talk about people who have pets often have healthier microbiomes than people who don't. So we've kind of got that, but I want to get into your area of expertise in this whole space of probiotics, right? So there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about probiotics. Like on the one hand, you've got people saying take probiotics, and on the other hand, you've got other people saying no, don't just go take a probiotic, because if it's not what you need, you're actually making things worse. And I feel like people are just kind of spinning around right now, kind of going, okay, I know I have a problem. I know I need something. I get the prebiotic, and I'm going to take a shortcut because I know we don't have a ton of time. By adjusting your diet and eating a diverse diet, like Kiran was talking about earlier, you're going to provide those prebiotics, the precursors to helping the microbiome to be healthier. But what about when we're bringing a probiotic in? There's a lot of myths in this space, and I would love you to kind of address some of them and help give people some guidance here.
Yeah, I think if you look at a few features of a probiotic, it becomes an important way of kind of filtering whether or not the probiotic has significant value, right? So number one, if the call out or the claim of the probiotic is about how many species it has and how many billions of CFUs it has, it's not really going to do much for you, right? Because if the way these people formulated the probiotic was just to hit a CFU count or hit a species number, they haven't really put a lot of thought into what the probiotic actually does.
Yeah.
And it follows this old misconception of just a lot is better. If 50 billion is good, 100 billion must be better, right? So I'm going to do 100 billion CFUs. And so the inundation of your system with these microbes can be a detriment if you don't have the right microbes in the probiotic. In fact, when I was at Microbiome Labs, we did some work with APC, which is at University College Cork, largest microbiome research center in the world. And they have found that most of the probiotic strains that they tested were actually inflammatory.
Ugh.
Right? It elicited a multifactorial inflammatory response in your body. This is why if you talk to a lot of functional holistic practitioners, there are certain patients that they don't give any probiotic to, like, mast cell activation patients or histamine intolerant patients, right? Or even SIBO people, because more often than not, the probiotics they try make it worse for them because they're already very inflammatory and very reactive. You put in 10 billion, 20, 30 billion of a bunch of bacteria, and your body doesn't recognize those bacteria as commensal in some way. It's going to react to it, right? It's going to elicit a pretty big response. So you want to be wary of any probiotic that's just touting numbers and concentration, because that's meaningless. The vast majority of studies on probiotics have been done with single strains at 2 to 3 billion CFUs. Rarely are studies done on 25, 30 strains with hundreds of billions of CFUs. So don't worry about all that. Those aren't really doing much of anything. And then also be wary of any probiotics that have to be refrigerated and taken with so much delicate care and all that stuff, because they're not really functioning like probiotics, right? If they have to be refrigerated, it's to maintain the viability of the strain on the shelf sitting in the bottle, right? And these strains have been shown to die at 70 degrees on the shelf. It's going to hit 98.6 degrees in your body and a pH of 1 going through your stomach. There's no chance of surviving, right? So it's just a bunch of dead bacteria going through. So those were the old ideas around what's a high quality probiotic. Was more strains, more CFUs, refrigerated was fantastic. All that stuff out the door. What you really want is a probiotic that has very specific functionality, right? So we'll talk about psychobiotics and how they actually affect that whole system we just talked about with inflammation in the brain and all that. Those are very specific microbes that have very specific functionality that nothing else does, and they don't do anything else beyond that, right? And then you've got types of probiotics like the spore-based probiotics. These are quorum sensing microbes. These are very unique microbes in that they have the ability of modulating your gut microbiome at relatively low concentration. So 2 to 3 billion can make a huge shift in your microbiome in a very positive way. And that is a very important feature of a probiotic that you'd want to consider. You want to know what that probiotic does to the rest of the microbiome, because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? You might take 100 billion CFUs and it might sound like a lot, right? But you're putting it into an ocean of 40, 50 trillion microbes, right? So that 100 billion CFU is a drop in the ocean, right?
Yeah.
And unless the microbes that you're taking in has the ability to shift the 40 trillion microbes, it's really not going to do a whole lot for you. So how does a small number of microbes have an impact on 40 trillion microbes? Through something called quorum sensing. Quorum sensing is the way microbes read other microbial signatures and the presence of other microbes, right? And when a bacteria can go into an ecosystem and start reading microbial signatures, those bacteria can identify the presence of dysfunctional microbes and problematic microbes, and then concentrate their numbers in a given area to bring down the growth of those dysfunctional microbes. They can also thereby encourage other commensals to produce compounds and all that to outcompete those dysfunctional microbes, and in fact increase the growth of commensal microbes. The spores, we published a couple of studies showing that when you add just 4 strains of a spore to a complex microbiome, we can dramatically increase almost 35 to 40% the diversity of the microbiome.
Wow.
In a short amount of time, right? And dramatically increase the production of short-chain fatty acids and urolithins and all of these beneficial things, because these little effectors are like the police or the patrol of
Yeah.
the microbiome. They can get other bacteria to do the things they're supposed to do. Those are the most powerful types of microbes. And so when we hypothesized that the right type of spores, because of their quorum sensing capability, could encourage all of the leaky gut, the bacteria that are important for remodeling the lining of the gut to prevent leaky gut, we did our first study in 2017 when we published, and we showed we could reduce leaky gut by almost 70% in 30 days without any other intervention, right?
Wow.
Without diet intervention, lifestyle intervention, anything else, just taking the probiotic so significantly. That endotoxin we talked about that leaks through and makes its way to the brain and interferes with dopamine and creates microglial activation, all of that reduced by 70% in 30 days without doing anything else, right?
That's incredible.
So it's mind-boggling that these bacteria can do that. So to me, that's one of the very powerful things you can add to your lifestyle changes, where you're, like you mentioned, diversifying your diet, cleaning up your diet, improving your sleep, trying to reduce your stress, getting out and exercising, doing some resistance training, right?
Mm-hmm.
Resistance training actually releases myokines from your muscles that actually have a peptide-like effect in cinching up the gut lining and increasing the diversity, right? So you might not think that, oh my God, I have IBS, I have a gut issue. Squats can actually help my gut. It does. There's a direct chemical effect of myokines being released by contracting muscles that seal up the lining of the gut, or help seal up the lining of the gut, and help increase diversity of the gut microbiome. So you do those things, you add in the spore-based probiotics, you increase your fiber intake to 50 grams or more each day, and you can absolutely alleviate a lot of that cycle of badness that we talked about earlier that has very scary and profound effects down the road, right? And when we're talking about the brain, you add in a psychobiotic. So there's a strain called Bifidobacterium longum 1714. This is a very unique bacteria in that it has this one single gene in it that codes for a carbohydrate called peptidoglycan. And this carbohydrate has the effect of dramatically reducing neurological inflammation, reducing cortisol's curve, reducing the microglial activation that we talked about and all the reactive oxygen species and inflammation that occurs in the brain. It even shifts brainwave function to allow you to tap into lower frequency brainwaves when you're under stress. And all of the while, it also helps with leakiness in the gut. Right.
Wow.
So there's about 8 published studies showing modulation of anxiety, depression, mood disorders, and all that, and a significant improvement in sleep when you take a psychobiotic like 1714. So you combine that with the spore-based probiotic like the Just Thrive probiotic, and then the lifestyle modulation, and you are really revamping that entire system that we talked about goes awry so easily.
That is crazy. That just wraps it up. That's pretty wild though. And now I'm going to ask you, go back to the fiber at 50 grams a day. As a holistic nutritionist, and you know this better than I do, people's fiber intake is pathetic.
Oh, it's so pathetic. Yes.
It is so bad. I've looked at when I used to work with clients one-on-one. I mean, if they got 15 grams of fiber a day, they were lucky, right? So one thing I do want to say is, you know what, guys, if you, and I think within that fiber mix, we want to mix. We want soluble fiber, we want insoluble fiber, and moving away. And, I'm sure there'll be people on the other end here screaming at me, but moving away from the mono diets, just like mono agriculture, like, I think we can maybe agree that there might be a use case scenario for a keto diet or whatever the case may be as an intervention for a period of time. But it seems to me that the premise of these mono diets is fundamentally flawed when you look at everything we've been talking about here. But going back to the fiber, if you take note and you notice that you're consuming 15 grams of fiber, please don't just crank it up to 50 overnight.
Yes, you're going to be very pissed at both of us.
Because here's the thing.
Yeah.
Here's another case of not having the right bacteria in the gut who can break them down. And then those that are there are going to do the best they can, and you're going to be super sad.
Yeah,
and
totally. Yeah, my recommendation to people, and this is, just to put into perspective how important fiber is, because there's nothing sexy about fiber, and people have been hearing this for a long time, like fiber,
Whatever. Yeah.
but let's put it into numbers and perspectives as to why this is so important, right? It's probably one of the most well-studied macronutrients there is. There's a lot of research on fiber, and then there's now a lot of meta-analysis studies too, which is studies of all bunch of studies on the topic. One of the most recent ones, a meta-analysis study, was published about 2 years ago, incorporated about 18 big studies, and the total number of subjects in the study was almost 1 million, right?
Wow.
So it's a million people worth of
A lot of people.
information. And
Yeah.
here's what they figured out, right? They figured out for every 10 grams of fiber you add to your daily diet, you reduce your relative risk of mortality by 10%. Right?
Gee.
Which is madness, right? So if you want to reduce your relative risk of mortality by 50%, get 50 grams of fiber, right? There's almost nothing else that can do that for us with that kind of linear scale. And they showed that every increment of addition of fiber had a noticeable benefit, meaning even if you add 1 gram, which is seemingly like whatever, it's just a gram, it makes a difference, right? If you add 2 grams, it makes a difference. Going from 5 grams a day to 10 grams a day has a huge difference. It's a linear scale where they actually didn't see a significant plateau at the top of the scale, right? So the benefits of fiber continue to increase in a linear manner. So the way I tell people is just think about that, right? There's a lot of good things we can do for our health, but very few things that have that kind of linear benefit.
Yeah.
And the magical thing about it is we can't even digest the fiber. We don't get anything out of the fiber. We don't pull nutrients out of it. There isn't some magical compound in the fiber, right? It's all going to feed your microbiome. So that again underscores the importance of your microbiome in your overall health, and feeding them should become a full-time job for us, right? As the host, we are hosting them in our system, and we're counting on them for thousands of biochemical functions, and just to survive. It is our job to feed them, right? And the way I tell people to think about fiber is like, think about trying to add somewhere around 3 or 4 grams a day in each week. So like if I'm consuming 8 grams this week a day, right? Roughly. Then next week, I want to try to consume around 12 grams per day.
Okay.
And
So
then the
it's nice,
following
easy
week,
slope.
nice
Yeah.
and easy, yeah, incremental. Like you said, you actually need to slowly increase the microbes that can utilize the fiber better, right? And convert them to the useful things that we need within our system. And like you mentioned, you really want to add both soluble and insoluble fiber. So if people just Google foods rich in insoluble fiber, foods rich in soluble fiber, there's and now with AI and Google and all that, it can tell you about how much fiber is in a gram or an ounce or a serving of those foods. Try to map it out where you're trying to get somewhere around, once you get up to that level of 50 grams a day, we're trying to get somewhere around 25, 30 grams from food, and you can maybe supplement another 15, 20 grams through psyllium husk and simple things like that, right? So that should be a really, really important task for everybody leaving here. Take a good probiotic like the Just Thrive spore-based probiotic that has the research showing the leaky gut and the modulation of the microbiome. Take a psychobiotic if you're stressed and you're dealing with anxiety, depression, all that, to help with the mood balancing. And then the other lifestyle things we talked about, all those things add up together to make a profound difference.
Yeah. So, and the psychobiotic is called Just Calm. And
Yeah.
how long does it normally take people to notice a difference with the Just Calm? I mean, that's
Usually
a tough
2
question
weeks.
because it depends. So it takes
Yeah.
a couple. So give it a good couple of weeks before
Yep.
you throw the bottle away and decide it didn't do anything for you.
Exactly. Yeah. And keep in mind that it doesn't work like like a Prozac or an anti-anxiety medication. It's not intervening in a biochemical process the way a medication would. What it's doing is it's fundamentally changing how your body responds to stress, right? Through the whole sympathetic, parasympathetic system, neurological system, and all that. So those kind of foundational changes take a little bit of time. But the good news is when they do change, the change is much more permanent. It's a much more foundational change to how your body responds to stress, rather than just trying to intervene with medications to just feel better temporarily.
Great. And so for people who are on medication, they can still use the Just Calm. That it won't
Absolutely.
interfere,
Yeah. They
right?
can
Like
it doesn't
just
interfere at all. No.
okay. Yeah, I
And
think that's
kids
just
can use it too,
interesting.
Yeah, kids who have tantrums and behavioral disorders, and those are manifestations of anxiety and panic in those kids, right? So you can
Mhm.
absolutely give it to them as well. There isn't an age issue there, and it can be significantly beneficial to kids.
Love it. Okay. Well, I mean, we're coming up on time. I think you, as always, have over delivered on the promise, Kiran Krishnan. Thank
My
you for that
pleasure.
for that master class. If people want, so we're talking about the Just Thrive probiotic line
Mhm.
here. And this is basically a line of products that did you have a hand in designing these or?
Yeah, and helping them
Yeah.
develop and do the studies and things. Yes.
Yeah. And so if you guys want to give these, I mean, I have a lot of clients like spore-biotics is it's their holy grail kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so if you want to get your hands on spore-biotics and give them a shot, and or the Just Calm, which is the psychobiotic you were talking about,
Mhm.
you can go to justthrive.com and use code NAT20, and that'll give you 20% 90-day supply of either the spore-biotic or the Just Calm.
Yeah.
But of course the 20% applies right across the website. So whatever is there, I think there's probably a fabulous fiber supplement in there too. I would.
Yeah, there's a prebiotic in there that's amazing,
Yeah.
that works at low doses, really increases keystone species and diversity and all that. There's the IgG, the immunoglobulin G, which is like a really intelligent binder. It only binds to things like toxins and bacterial byproducts and microbes and things like that versus a general binder that just grabs everything. Right.
Right.
And the IgG can be very beneficial for people with very inflammatory sensitive systems.
Right.
It's one of the things that I use on a daily basis to kind of reduce the load that my liver has to take on every day dealing with all the toxins in the
Okay.
outside world.
Awesome. Well, yeah, because we were going to talk about IgG, but we didn't quite
Hmm.
get there. But that's a good little snapshot of why, and people might want to give it a try. Well, thank you so much again.
My pleasure.
Always a pleasure. And we're just going to have to make this an annual event.
Yeah. Sounds good to me. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.